This is HighIntensityBusiness.com with Lawrence Neal, helping you achieve your health and fitness goals. Become a great personal trainer and build your high-intensity strength training business.
This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I have ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all of the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To find out more about ARX and get $500 off install when you place an order, please go to arxfit.com and mention HIB, that's High Intensity Business, in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $500 off install when you place an order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter HIB in the How Did You Hear About Us field. Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to HighIntensityBusiness.com. This is episode 273. And today's topic is efficacy versus effectiveness when it comes to exercise, but more specifically, implementing exercise into the real world from the lab, trying to bridge that gap, so to speak. And today's guest to talk about that is one of my favorite people in exercise, Dr. James Steele. James is Associate Professor of Sport and Exercise Science at Solent University and is also the Principal Investigator at the UK Active Research Institute. He has extensive research and consultancy experience in physical activity, exercise and sports, working with elite athletes across a range of sports, the general population across the lifespan, and both those who are healthy and diseased. James was a member of the expert working group revising the CMO Physical Activity Guidelines for the UK and the Expert Committee for Communications, and is a founding member of both the Strength and Conditioning Society, Society for Transparency, Openness and Replication in Kinesiology. James is also a member of the American College of Sports Medicine and the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, and is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. James, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be back, Lawrence. Feels like it's been a long time.
It does feel like it's been a long time, far too long, actually. So great to have you back, and excited to dig into today's topic and learn about the research from yourself. So where should we start on this one? So efficacy versus effectiveness. So do you want to, start out by talking maybe about the genesis, about this idea, and then how it developed and some of the research around it?
Sure, yeah. So as some of the listeners might be aware, a couple of years back, I took a slight turn in terms of the research that I was doing. So obviously still working in and around resistance training specifically with colleagues like Dr. James Fisher. But I started working with the UK Active Research Institute and looking at kind of physical activity and exercise more generally, more on the kind of public health end of the spectrum. So looking at that kind of, more population health approach. And but it was actually slightly before that, and something that led me towards that was coming across a paper which was written by the UK Active Research Institute Scientific Advisory Board back in, it was either 2015 or 2016, I forget off the top of my head now, which was called Death by Effectiveness, Exercise as Medicine Caught in the Efficacy Trap. And I remember coming across it at the time because I was becoming more and more interested in how we can take some of the things that we've been learning from our studies of resistance training and how to manipulate resistance training interventions to optimize outcomes such as strength. The more and more I was realizing, that these interventions could be quite simple, I was asking myself questions like, okay, well, how do we actually get people to do it? And so I wasn't aware of the terminology at the time until I came across this paper, but it talked about this idea of differentiating between what is called efficacy and what is called effectiveness. And so to define those terms, I guess, for the listeners, when we talk about efficacy when it comes to interventions, whether that's exercise or a drug therapy or any kind of intervention, what we're talking about is whether or not the intervention has an effect on the outcome that we're interested in when it is delivered under ideal conditions. So an example of that would be in an exercise intervention, we might have a very tightly controlled protocol that we use. We would invite people into the lab or a very tightly controlled environment, and we would make sure that they did the protocol exactly as it was designed to be delivered. We would make sure it has extremely high fidelity, and we then observe whether or not it produces the outcomes that we're interested in. So this would be similar to what are called phase 1, 2, and 3 trials in drug development. So it's trying to understand whether the drug itself, based on its pharmacokinetics and when people actually take it in the right doses, does it produce a desired outcome? But that's very different from asking the question of, if I recommend or prescribe this intervention, this exercise protocol, or this drug, does it produce the effects that I'm interested in? Because in that question, we're then taking away some of the control over the delivery of that intervention. So we might lose some of the fidelity of that intervention, and that might have an impact then on the effectiveness of it. So in the exercise example, a intervention that's been shown to be highly efficacious in controlled conditions won't necessarily produce the same magnitude of results when we then go to try and apply it in the real world, because we might have issues of adherence, people might not put in a sufficient intensity of effort, they might deviate from the protocol in slight ways that impact its effectiveness. The same with a drug treatment. So whether someone takes a drug is a different question, or the effect that a drug has when someone takes it is a different question to what effect the drug has when a doctor prescribes it, because people may or may not take the drug, they may not follow the exact dosing protocols, etc. So it was a real eye-opener to me to come across this kind of area, or these two concepts, this differentiation between efficacy and effectiveness, and it got me thinking a lot more about what do we really understand about exercise generally, physical activity generally, and with respect to how effective it actually is for improving health, well-being, longevity, etc. Are we limited primarily to efficacy data? And it was interesting to first come across those concepts a few years back, and it's very much kind of directed my interests in the last few years.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, super interesting. It's one of those things where I think a lot of people get stuck in the weeds, debating all the different studies about the efficacy of different training protocols and different variables like effort intensity and volume and frequency and all these things. And yet a lot of the time we forget just that a lot of people just aren't doing anything at all. And a lot of people just don't really seem to adhere to these types of protocols. Which is one of the main issues. I read through this article that you just mentioned, the Death by Effectiveness: Exercise as Medicine Caught in the Efficacy Trap, and we'll link to that in the show notes because it's a really short read, which always makes me very happy. I was printing it out and there's one page, and I was like, oh, thank God. Versus one of the other papers you sent me, which was like 20 pages. And one of the lines that I thought was really interesting in this paper, actually, I just wanted to talk to you about briefly, is it talks about, it says, I'll actually just read it. I'll read it here. It says, on the basis of the above, we believe that SEM, which is short for sport and exercise medicine, risks being sidelined in public health. If we are to provide critical health support to SEM and arguably to, how do you say that? Beleaguered health services? Beleaguered, sorry. Health services. That lifeline is the production of high quality phase 4 effectiveness research. And it occurred to me, what's your thoughts briefly on, I mean, this is clearly very relevant right now. Basically that's talking about the overburden in health services, right? Like the NHS, stuff like that. And clearly right now that's a hot topic. I mean, the reason why COVID-19 is so feared, and we have all these policies going on around social distancing is not so much the necessarily the direct impact of the virus, but also the knock-on effect, the effect it will have on the healthcare system, and how it will perhaps cause people to die from other comorbidities or diseases which have no relation, just because the health service is so overburdened. So just curious, do you think that this kind of exploration you're doing and looking at more research around what's actually going to be effective for the general public is actually going to really have a big impact on just healthcare and health services?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so in the last couple of years, I've had, the good fortune or misfortune, depending upon how you want to look at it, of spending a lot of time with these, with policymakers and decision makers, in these areas. Through UK Active, we spend a lot of time talking with, high-ranking officials within the National Health Service, speaking with Public Health England and government divisions about the policies that they are making. And, it's a lot of this work is around physical activity more generally. And the question when it comes to, a policymaker deciding whether or not to invest in a particular service is always down to the effectiveness that it can have. And one of the things that we often kind of like overlook at, there's as a side note, there's this kind of debate between, or rivalry between those who are kind of more on the exercise physiology end of the spectrum and those who are more working in physical activity and public health. And the public health practitioners, are more interested in just getting people doing anything, and the exercise physiologists want everyone doing, high intensity training and so on. When in reality, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle when it comes to, what's going to be the best thing on a population level. And the reality is we don't really know, because we don't necessarily have the research that specifically asks those questions in a rigorous enough manner. What is going to have the biggest outcome, the best outcomes in terms of effectiveness? So, we may have, two ends of a spectrum when it comes to delivering exercise interventions. We may, be fairly confident that in terms of efficacy for a range of different health outcomes, and we'll set aside the fact that the reality is we have no idea whether exercise in any form actually causally increases mortality or reduces mortality risk. But that's a separate story. But
hang on, I want to pause you there. Could you just elaborate on that for a moment? Because I was not aware of that.
Sure. So the evidence that we have around mortality risk reduction is purely observational at present.
Right.
It is there is no
even the stuff on like grip strength and strength as being a factor to reduce or cause mortality. Is that all epidemiology? Is it?
It's all observational epidemiology, and I know you spoke with Jeremy about this before as well. But the evidence for even the observational evidence for the impact of behaviours such as engaging in physical activity or exercise, or resistance training specifically, that's even weaker than necessarily the association between strength and mortality risk. But when it comes to and this would have to probably be a separate podcast in and of itself.
Sure.
When it comes to determining the causal effects of doing something on an outcome that you're interested in, you need a certain type of evidence to really be able to answer that. And the gold standard is obviously to do a randomized controlled trial. And this is kind of absence of evidence, more so than evidence of absence. But there are very few trials, partly because they're hard to do, because it takes a long time for people to die, and when that's your outcome, it then makes the study very expensive. But what studies we do have that have looked at long-term intervention trials on mortality risk, such as the Look Ahead study, and a couple of other studies that have looked at diabetes more specifically, tend to find that actually there's not a huge impact on mortality risk itself. But coming back around to the point, that may be, there's a big focus now, more so now, on adding quality to your years than extending the amount of years that you have. And so policymakers are quite rightly interested in quality of life. As most of us are, we want to enjoy disease-free, healthy, happy lives. And bringing it kind of back round to the point I was making, we do know that certain types of exercise interventions have a greater efficacy for improving certain markers of health and well-being, etc. And we know that others have less of an effect on that. And broadly speaking, you could probably put that on a spectrum of the harder you work, the more you're going to get out of it in terms of your exercise interventions. But that's, again, a very separate question to which is going to have the biggest effectiveness if you were to recommend it on a population level. Because it may well be that the thing that has the biggest impact in terms of efficacy, no one does, or no one does it correctly. And so that efficacy that it could have if it was done ideally never translates into effectiveness out in the real world. And contrastingly, the interventions that have very poor efficacy may actually be able to maintain the magnitude of effect that it has when applied in the real world, and so have potentially greater effectiveness than the things that we know are more efficacious.
It's frustrating though, isn't it? Because as you and I are really passionate about making exercise as efficacious as possible for ourselves, as well as all of my listeners and our colleagues in fitness and high intensity training in business. And it's just sad to hear though that you're probably right in that we're probably going to be looking at something perhaps much less intense. I don't know. We'll perhaps get into that to make it actually effectiveness in the real world to the general population.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I mean, I a while ago now, I kind of gave myself over to the fact that the reality is that we're probably going to be having to look for some Goldilocks zone in terms of what's the most we can get people to do, rather than what's optimal. Because from what we know, people are unlikely to do it. But the reality of it as well is that this is still actually an unanswered question, because we don't really have the studies to conclude that. Now, one of the issues with this is it's quite hard to do things like randomized controlled trials on the effectiveness end of the spectrum, because they require tapping into either existing service delivery. And sorry, I'm using terminology that kind of relates more to healthcare, I guess, at the moment.
That's okay. I'm following.
I'll try and bring it back to an example that might be more applicable to business owners.
No, it's fine. It's fine. If it's easier to talk about it in the healthcare context, it's absolutely fine, and we can bring. I'll perhaps ask you to clarify if needed, but I think it's fairly straightforward. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the issues is that by the time you get to that kind of service delivery end of the spectrum, people are normally implementing things because they think it already works. They don't necessarily have the evidence that it has effectiveness. They may have evidence that it has efficacy, and they're hoping that it will translate into effectiveness. So a good example of this is exercise referral schemes. Within the UK, They have been around since the 1990s. And generally, these are schemes whereby a general practitioner, a physician, or some other healthcare professional will refer an individual who is presently inactive, sedentary, and normally has some kind of long-term condition like diabetes. They might have, long-term musculoskeletal pain. They may have, cardiovascular disease or even just obesity. And these have been around for a long time, and there's always been questions around whether or not they are actually producing results that are worthwhile. And the argument has always been, well, we know we've got loads of evidence that for all of these conditions, exercise, and I'm using the term quite broadly here because the interventions are applied quite broadly once you get to that kind of end of the spectrum where they're actually being delivered. We know they improve, risk factors for all of these diseases. They improve symptoms for these diseases. People feel better. But the reality is we actually have limited evidence as to whether or not they're producing those results. And so one of the things that we did recently was to try and get a picture and evaluate, what impact are these exercise referral schemes having? And so we tried to conduct some effectiveness research by taking data from all of these, from a lot of existing exercise referral schemes across the UK, and looking to see, what effect they were having out in the real world on all of these outcomes where there had been evidence for the efficacy of the interventions. And so I think I sent you over the paper that we published around that.
Right here in front of me.
Sure, yeah, and now this picked up a lot of press because obviously the findings in a nutshell were that these exercise referral schemes don't seem to be having the impact that it's hoped that they would be. Very few outcomes that are examined seem to improve to any meaningful degree. This was a big analysis. We had almost 24,000 participants who had been through exercise referral schemes ranging from 6 weeks to 3 months. A caveat is we don't really know what these schemes were doing. But they're, on the whole, if we were asking the broad question of whether these exercise referral schemes are working, the answer would be probably not. Now, I guess to kind of bring this back to the applicability to high intensity training business owners is we often hear that kind of question of does HIIT work, which it's similar to asking do exercise referral schemes work. We're asking a question about whether out in the real world if we were to recommend that people do HIIT, would it actually produce the results that we're interested in? Now, the only way we're going to find that out is with data from real-world interventions. And so it may well be that one way of looking to answer this question is for more business owners who are delivering these interventions to collect data on outcomes that are of interest to identify whether or not it's working. And, that might be strength, but it might be broader outcomes such as quality of life measures, well-being, mental well-being, etc. Mm-hmm. And in exactly the same way as how we evaluated these exercise referral schemes, we tapped into existing data sets that were being collected by these schemes. Now, the interesting thing is most of these schemes were collecting data and they didn't really know what to do with it. They were just collecting it for the sake of collecting it because they felt like they had to do so. It wasn't until we came along and took that data and then decided to analyze it that we were really able to put it to good use. But there's no reason why high intensity training business owners couldn't be doing the same thing and contributing to some kind of bigger public data set that would enable researchers like myself, James Fisher, or others to tap into it and try and identify, are these interventions, are these approaches to training people producing the outcomes, that we would expect them to. when they're applied out in the real world.
Let me just pause you there for a sec. So obviously the difference is in a HIT studio, you've got typically one-on-one or small group supervision, and you've got someone who's perhaps more of an expert in terms of their understanding of how to apply evidence-based exercise. So yeah, I mean, in that environment, like, we know people are going to get good outcomes, right, for a lot of these measures. I mean, all those measures in this particular paper include things like BMI, systolic blood pressure, those kind of mental health, well-being measures you mentioned. I mean, is that not fairly conclusive? Like, do we not know that that's the reality? And the problem is adherence and self-efficacy and, being able to produce a high degree of effort in isolation. Is that not the issue here, or am I off the mark with that view?
No, you're bang on there, Lawrence. So the question, you then move on to the next question, which is, something that we had to acknowledge was a limitation, for example, in this exercise referral scheme, is we analysed, and I'm doing air quotes here, exercise referral schemes. The reality was, though, all of these schemes that we evaluated could have been doing very different things. If we knew what they were doing, we would then be able to perform some kind of comparative analysis. So expanding that point about wider data collection to enable that, larger evaluation of real world practice to take place, what you would want to see as well is data being collected in alternative approaches that might employ, for example, a similar sort of approach of one-to-one personal training, but employing different types of resistance training interventions. And that way you can start to take those data sets and compare them to see which interventions are having, the greater impact out in the real world, upon effectiveness. And, these can, to give you an example of where I'm currently working on something that employs these, because the reality is, and in somewhat an ironic manner, these are technically observational data sets themselves. They're still technically, they're not experimental. They're not data sets where people are being randomized to receive an intervention. There are confounders that might influence the effectiveness of the intervention, or even the likelihood that people are going to choose those interventions. And so there are more and more recently now, these are techniques that have been around for a long time, but are more widely being now applied across fields such as, healthcare, and, found their way into physical activity and exercise interventions on the public health end of the spectrum. But there are actually ways of using observational data and drawing causal inferences about the effects of interventions or behaviors upon certain outcomes. And for those who want a really great introduction to this idea of kind of causal inference from observational data, I definitely recommend that people look up a book called The Book of Why by Judea Pearl and Mackenzie. It's a fantastic introduction to causal inference. It's written for a kind of more wider popular audience, but they talk about ways in which, the idea with a randomized controlled trial is that the randomization element effectively takes care of all the confounding variables that could influence or could mask the intervention effect. And so when you don't have the ability to randomize individuals, you have to come up with ways of accounting for that. And to do that, you have to think, well, what's going to potentially impact my intervention? So to come back to an example of where we're going to be looking at observational data to try and draw a causal inference about the effectiveness of a particular intervention. I'm working with a group in Greater Manchester here in the UK on a project called the Prehab for Cancer project. And I got involved in the project because they were looking to design a prehabilitation program for cancer sufferers who were undergoing elective surgery. And they had a very short window of time based on how the system here in the UK works, based on when diagnosis happens, and they have deadlines for when people have to be kind of referred for surgery and so on. So there's these kind of like very short windows, and essentially they had 3 weeks to deliver an exercise intervention to try and get these cancer patients as strong and fit and healthy as possible before going into surgery. And now there's some data from some randomized trials suggesting that prehabilitation prior to surgery or treatment in cancer, may improve recovery, may improve mortality. But these trials are really, really hard to do. As previously explained, it's hard to do these kind of randomized trials out in the real world. And so in Manchester, instead, what they decided is they would just start doing this as standard delivery, and they would look to then evaluate it using a slightly different method. So and people are probably wondering, what is the intervention? So the intervention is essentially a high intensity of effort resistance training protocol in addition to a high intensity interval training program as well. And so it's twice a week for 3 weeks, using a progressive introduction of greater and greater intensities of effort by manipulating the set endpoints. So they start off doing kind of non-repetition maximum. They then go to self-determined rep max, where they're kind of stopping 1 rep short of failure and then culminating in finally getting the patients to train to failure using a whole body program. And then they also do a twice a week reduced intensity of effort interval training session as well.
Was that design influenced by, I remember that other podcast we did about effort and some of the science you did there, about how people get better. I can't remember, you have to remind me, but is it people get better at training with high degree of effort once they're more practiced and more exposed to a training stimulus? Did that have a part to play in the study design there, where you had them ramp up?
Yeah, to some extent. It was actually we did a study with Jürgen Giesing in older adults, which was a 6-month intervention, but which we essentially took and truncated into this 3-week protocol. But really, it was an element of trying to anticipate what factors might improve the effectiveness of it by facilitating its implementation. So most of these patients were people receiving a cancer diagnosis. The last thing on their mind is wanting to begin an exercise protocol, but also a lot of them were completely sedentary beforehand as well. So we had 3 weeks to throw them in. We didn't have time to do kind of familiarization and period within before the intervention. So we had to kind of build it in there as well and gradually build them up. But anyway,
do you have the outcome? Sorry, yeah, go on. Continue. Sorry, go ahead.
No, we don't. We're the evaluation is going to be taking place. Because it's a very big trial. Well, not a trial technically. The evaluation is going to be. It's still running actually, so we don't have any outcome data at the moment. But so from the implementation of the Prehab for Cancer program, essentially every patient who met the criteria and was diagnosed was offered the intervention. And so because of that, we don't have any bias based upon self-selection into the program. It's not like a specific group of people were offered it and there might therefore be confounders because we target a particular group. Everyone in Greater Manchester was being offered this intervention if they met the criteria of being diagnosed and referred for elective surgery. Now, what that did was that creates one big intervention group. And the issue that you have with that is without some sort of comparator, you're unable to, really know whether or not the intervention produced the outcomes or not, or whether it was just something else, time or, some other confounding variable. And so one of the benefits we had in this case was that Manchester has a lot of historical data in these types of patients. So before the implementation of this Prehab for Cancer program, there was what you could call standard care, which was they got a little bit of advice on what to expect with respect to their surgery when it came around, but other than that, they didn't really get a lot. So what we're going to be able to do is go back and access all of the health record data from this group, which includes everyone pre a particular time point, who were given this kind of usual care approach, and look at their outcomes in comparison to the people after the implementation of the Prehab for Cancer program. And we're going to be able to use techniques such as what's called propensity score matching to essentially create two groups that control for the types of variables that we think might confound our outcomes. So we'll be able to look at the data and draw similarly matched age groups, similarly matched for gender or sex, similarly matched for things like baseline BMI and so on and so forth. So we're able to, ahead of time, think what things do we think other than our intervention are going to impact these outcomes, and then using the data set that we're creating from doing this intervention and using other publicly available data, we're able to essentially kind of emulate the randomized controlled trial that we would do if we were logistically able to actually do that type of trial. And so again, bringing this back round for, and this doesn't just apply to HIIT, it applies really to any kind of exercise intervention between these kind of warring camps. We all argue about the minutiae, but what we're arguing about is minutiae relating to efficacy. To really get at the question of whether or not, there are differences in effectiveness, we need to be looking at how do we facilitate these types of studies? How do we create large publicly available data sets that we can then take and potentially compare in the same sort of way as which we're doing with the Prehab for Cancer program, that enable us to draw some causal inference as to the effects of these interventions in comparison to one another.
So what would be, maybe you've touched on this already to an extent, but what would be your advice to those interested in trying to contribute to that? What would they need to be tracking? How would they design that in their studios? In a nutshell?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one good thing about the HIIT community is that everyone collects data anyway. It may all be on old paper records and so on and so forth, but there is a lot of data out there, there is the possibility that data could be collated and some kind of database produced from that. There are other, some businesses do use electronic records. And they have big data sets that are there waiting to be examined. One example is Fit20. In fact, I'm going to be at some point working with them to look at their data and see what we can identify from it. But the problem with that is we're still just looking at one broad kind of intervention. We're not necessarily able to draw comparisons. And we're only able to look at what outcomes people have decided to collect. And this was a problem we had with the exercise referral schemes when we looked at them, is that we were limited to look at what there was data available on. So it just so happened that a lot of schemes collected blood pressure. A lot of schemes collected body mass index. And so we were able to collate quite big data sets looking at these. It may be that a lot of, most HIIT facilities, I imagine, are probably collecting, load progression, which we can use to use as a proxy for strength, it is strength. But so we'll probably likely have the strength data. But one of the things that, and we've argued this with respect to, exercise referral schemes more broadly as well, is when it comes to thinking about what outcomes to collect, really, you've got to think about, who's asking the question, who really cares about the answer as to whether or not, X is better than Y, or whether or not, high intensity training works out in the real world. Who are we trying to convince? Now, with exercise referral schemes, the people that are being you're trying to convince you're trying to help make decisions are policymakers and people who are investing in these schemes as public health interventions. And so really the question comes down to, what do you want to measure? Well, you should measure the things that would help these people make decisions. Now, this may not be something that's quite as applicable for all high intensity business owners out there. Everyone people are from different countries where there are different local contexts, and it may be that these individuals are not necessarily trying to broaden out to employ their interventions as public health measures. But you could take this and apply it on a smaller scale, even within your own facilities as well. So you could quite easily, for example, ask the question of, within my facility, what types of interventions are going to be most effective for my clients? And you don't necessarily need to run a randomized controlled trial to find that out, but you do need to collect data on these different types of interventions and then look to apply the right sorts of analytic techniques to be able to draw those causal inferences from them. So you might have, you might think to yourself, well, I want to know whether or not applying these kinds of, advanced techniques versus just doing a simple, one set to failure approach, which is going to be, more effective, not more efficacious. What's going to be more effective? And, that's a different question from, what's more efficacious, which are, even the types of studies that we've done with Luke and the guys at Discover Strength, they're still focused on answering the question of efficacy, not necessarily answering the question of effectiveness. So, you could employ different interventions, collect the right data, and then work with, individuals, researchers who are experienced in understanding causal inference from these types of data to find out, what's working better for the outcomes that are interesting to you and meaningful to you or meaningful to your clients, to understand, whether it's working.
Can you just clarify what outcomes would you be trying to measure in this particular example to understand effectiveness over efficacy?
So the outcomes don't have to be different in those respects. So, to give a simple example, let's say, in a tightly controlled study where you're looking at the efficacy of an intervention, you decide you want to know its efficacy upon strength. And so you do an intervention, you might compare it to another one, or you might just compare it to a control, and you find out, how big is the impact on strength of doing this intervention, what in terms of its efficacy. Now, you could still ask the same question and look at the effectiveness on strength, but what you're doing is you're then taking that intervention outside of that tightly controlled environment and you're employing it out in the real world. You can still look at the same outcome measures, but what you'll see is whether or not the magnitude of that outcome, when looked at under tightly controlled in a tightly controlled context, whether that translates to a similar magnitude out in the real world. So does that efficacy translate to effectiveness?
So it's almost in your interest to have lots of confounding variables when trying to look at effectiveness, because you're trying to understand how a particular protocol is going to apply out in the real world, right? So you almost encourage that. Am I right in my understanding of that?
Yeah. Well, so encourage is maybe a little strong, but no. So another way of looking at it is, and terms that people may or may not be familiar is the idea of maximizing internal versus external validity, or I think we've sometimes used the phrase ecological validity.
That's it. Right.
And when you maximize internal validity, you try and remove as many confounding variables, if not all of them, so that you can just understand the impact of the independent variable, the thing that you're manipulating, the thing that you're interested in. Whereas when you're maximizing external validity or ecological validity, you want all of those, you want to see whether or not the effect is still there, even when there's all of these other confounding variables impacting it.
Right. So let me just make sure I understand this. Okay, so you've got a group, you've got one that's looking at efficacy, it's tightly controlled, lab almost conditions, you've got you're controlling all the variables, you've got a control group, and then you measure that the outcome for strength is improved by X protocol, but you then carry out the same kind of thing, but in an environment with less controls, and you're just basically looking for if by using all the obviously proper statistical analysis after the fact, you see the same effect, then that intervention of efficacy is also effective.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't articulate that anywhere near as well as you did, but I'm just trying to understand that for myself.
No. I think that was a good summary.
Okay. Just curious, I want to dig into this paper for a moment if it's ideal time to do so. Your paper, Effective Exercise Referral Schemes, that one. Unless you were on on a roll there and you wanted to continue your line of thinking.
No. I can move on to talking about that.
Okay, so I had a question regarding, what exactly the exercise referral schemes. I mean, you kind of described how they kind of work, but and where they sort of come from. But what do they actually look like in practice? I mean, you said in the paper, obviously this came from an enormous national referral database where there were 23,731 participants. But what are these? What are they telling them to do? Is it like, I mean, I know there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of they're all different and you don't actually know what they were specifically. But what is your feeling? Like, what do you think the types of schemes were actually, what were the actual exercise recommendations and things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess just to quickly sort of like explain, the purpose of that we in that paper, we focus on the question very broadly of what, do we broadly see that people going through exercise referral schemes improve their health outcomes to a meaningful degree? We didn't ask, which types of exercise referral schemes work best. And what we found was that there was a lot of differences between schemes. So we had 13 different schemes, as you say, with nearly 24,000 patients going through there over a number of years. And we found that when we looked at we used a technique called individual patient data meta-analysis. And so for those, not to confuse anyone, but when people think of meta-analysis, they often think of taking the results of other studies and then pooling them together to draw a general conclusion. And that's exactly what meta-analysis is most commonly used for. But really, it's just a statistical technique. It can be used for data from within one study, as much as it can be used to collate data from other studies. And so all it really is it's a form of what we call multi-level statistical model. And so in this scheme, because we knew that we had lots of different schemes and we didn't know what they were doing, we assumed that there would probably be a lot of variation between the schemes. And so we used this technique to draw an overall conclusion as to broadly what effects are they having. But as I said, different schemes were having greater or lesser effects than other schemes. And if you look at some of the forest plots in the paper, you'll see that each scheme, that the estimates of the effects of all of these schemes are all over the place. There's a lot of variation in them. Now, this was interesting because we did. I should note that this database is also being used for one of my PhD students' research, who's recently graduated. That's Dr. Nikita Rowley, who has been focusing on the physical activity levels as an outcome from these data. And she's recently had that paper accepted as well, and that will be published shortly. But one of the things that she decided to do retrospectively was, in this data, we didn't, like I said, have information on what the schemes were doing. So to answer your question, we didn't know what they were doing. We suspected that because most exercise referral schemes, purely just based on our experience and having Nikita has worked for a number of years with various exercise referral schemes, most of them are a bog standard kind of mixture of resistance training and cardio done in a leisure center or gym-based setting, normally under supervision, whether that's for the entirety of the intervention or whether it's that they're provided with a program and then they go do it themselves, can vary. But we thought it would be more prudent to actually ask the schemes themselves that question. And so we were able to go back and ask some of these schemes, what are they actually doing? And we used a standard template for reporting of exercise interventions, which is used in research, called the Consensus on Exercise Reporting template. And we formulated a series of questions based upon that template to find out exactly what the schemes are doing. And so we've got that paper under preparation at the moment, and not all of the schemes responded. And in fact, some of the schemes that we didn't actually have data on responded to the survey as well. So we got a slightly wider one. And hang on, I'm going to quickly open the paper because otherwise I will forget exactly how many schemes we managed to survey. I want to say it was around 30 to 40 schemes across the UK. So, and I should caveat as well, we actually have no idea how many exercise referral schemes exist across the UK. The latest estimate, although there's no indication of where they came up with that number, is that there's around 500 or so schemes across the UK. So 30 to 40 is probably just shy of 10% or so of schemes across the UK. But it pretty much confirmed our conclusions that, or our assumptions that most of these schemes are just employing your general bog standard, kind of ACSM, 3 sets of 10 type resistance training intervention. They're doing some, low intensity, low to or moderate intensity of effort, cardio type training, whether that's on a treadmill or a bike or whatever. And they're delivered and implemented in a range of different, in a variety of different manners as well. So some of them are implemented by those individuals who have specific exercise referral qualifications. Others are not. Some include additional behavior change techniques alongside the implementation of the intervention itself to try and maximize that. So that might be something as simple as goal setting. But what we found was that there seems to be quite a variety of ways in which these schemes are being delivered. But one thing that stuck out to me was that we also asked them, what's the typical kind of intensity of effort that they employ? And most of these schemes are very kind of low intensity of effort. So they're not particularly using, they don't necessarily collect it, but retrospectively when they're reporting it, they seem to be suboptimal to what we would expect based upon the efficacy research. And so, this almost comes back around full circle. We have this evidence that the effectiveness of the interventions of exercise referral schemes doesn't seem to be particularly impressive, but that might be because of the way in which they're being implemented.
Interesting. Do you know what you just made me think of there? You made me think of a message I had from, I think it was either Skylar or Bryce a while back, and they made a joke. They said, to be or not to be, in relation to 2B muscle fibers. I thought you might appreciate that, and you made me think of that when you said that they were using a low or moderate intensity, and I'm sure you probably agree that their outcomes would be much better if they were able to train for a higher degree of effort and actually fatigue those higher order motor units. But that's a whole nother conversation that we've spoke on at length on other podcasts. So this study, which I'll just read out the title here so people can find it in the show notes. It's called Effective Exercise Referral Schemes Upon Health and Wellbeing, Initial Observational Insights Using Individual Patient Data Meta-Analysis from the National Referral Database. We'll link that up. You've already mentioned this about the results, that although there were statistically significant changes in things like BMI, systolic blood pressure, there's mental health and well-being outcomes, resting heart rate, they weren't really meaningful degrees of improvement. Now, one of the things I just wanted to ask you about is at the start of the results, it says estimates brackets 95% CIs. Is that confidence interval? Is that what that means?
Yeah, that's correct.
What does that mean? Is that the accuracy based on the measurement method used? Could you just explain that? Because I don't really understand that.
Yeah. So technically speaking, the technical definition of a confidence interval, or a 95% confidence interval in this specific example, it's based upon the idea of a frequentist statistical paradigm where you consider probability to be long run frequencies essentially. So in a similar way to a p-value, a 95% confidence interval essentially tells you that if you were to, run this study, for example, so randomly sample, a number of exercise referral schemes and calculate, and then do the same analyses and come up with an estimate. If you were to do that, say 100 times, for example, then 95% of the confidence intervals that you produced would be likely to include the true population estimate that you're trying to get. So I guess to expand on that a little bit more, part of the reason for using statistics in these studies is because we're trying to draw an inference about something that we can't necessarily observe ourselves. So when we say, right, the estimate, for example, for change in body mass index was a reduction in body mass of 0.55 kilograms per meter squared with a confidence interval of minus 0.69 to minus 0.41, sorry. Mm-hmm. What we're saying is that we have a sample of data, but we're trying to draw an inference as to what we think the actual mean change in BMI would be in the larger population from which that sample is drawn. So in this case, everyone undergoing every exercise referral scheme in the UK would be what we're trying to estimate with our sample. And it's exactly the same in the types of studies that we do. We run a study with 50 individuals, and what we're doing is we're using the data from that study to draw an inference about what we think the effect is in the larger population if we were able to, actually measure it in that population.
Got it. Okay, cool. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, ARX. Are you looking to create a cutting-edge, high-intensity training facility? Are you confused on what equipment to use or how to separate yourself from the masses? Well, then ARX Fit might be the answer you're looking for. I asked Mike Polano from ARX a few questions about how ARX machines are challenging the status quo of the exercise industry around the globe. Mike, if you could, give the listeners a quick summary of why ARX is so different from the traditional machines or tools they're used to seeing in most exercise facilities.
ARX is totally different than anything you've seen before. This isn't just another weight stack machine. We've looked at the last 40 years of exercise technology and used that knowledge to create something entirely new. ARX uses a new form of resistance, a motor, and we pair that motor with computer software so that we can maximize the safety, effectiveness, and efficiency of your workouts. So you may be asking, okay, but how does ARX compare to weights? Traditional machines you see in gyms today are based on lifting metal weights and battling gravity. What people don't realize is that when you're forced to lift a static weight like this, one that doesn't adapt or change while you use it, you're underloading yourself rep after rep. And this unnecessarily limits your ability to make improvements. With ARX, we've taken a totally different approach. We removed weights and gravity from the equation altogether. Instead, ARX combines our patented motorized resistance with our custom computer software to provide you with the world's safest, most effective, and most quantified form of resistance training ever. When you train with ARX, you are training to your perfect level of resistance, both positively and negatively 100% of the time. No more guessing what weight to use. ARX does all of that for you, instantly and automatically. We'll also track and measure every second of every rep, so you can quantify all of your workouts to find out if you're improving and by exactly how much. Whether your goals are bigger muscles, increased strength, stronger bones, or just to look good in a bathing suit, ARX can help you achieve all of these and more, but do so in a fraction of the time it would take compared to traditional equipment. If you're looking for the most efficient, most effective, and most quantified piece of exercise equipment on the market today, then look no further than ARX.
Thanks, Mike. That all sounds really impressive. If you'd like to learn more about ARX, visit arxfit.com and mention that you heard about ARX on the High Intensity Business podcast to receive an exclusive deal of $500 off shipping and installation of your ARX machines. So one thing you sort of started talking about there before I jumped in with that question was you were talking about, you kind of said, we don't know if the exercise referral schemes don't work or that they're being implemented incorrectly. So how can you expand on that? Like, what does that mean by being implemented incorrectly? Like that maybe there's a set protocol, but they're not delivering it as prescribed. Is that kind of what you're suggesting there, and maybe use more with the system than it is the protocol?
Yeah, absolutely.
Service delivery, using your terminology.
You know, you're a seasoned podcaster there now, Lawrence. You've really drawn me back into the final point that we were discussing.
That was accidental.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you know, obviously, when we for the listeners, when I suggested this to Lawrence, I said we should talk about efficacy and effectiveness, but also implementation. And one of the things I mentioned very early on was this idea of fidelity. And really all that's talking about is whether or not the thing, so in this context, like you say, you know, you come up with a protocol that you want to deliver. And that protocol can be as fine-grained as I want people to do this many sets, this many reps, you know, go to failure or whatever. It can be very specific around the parameters around the exercise itself, or, you know, it can include other elements. You know, it has to include, you know, this kind of behavior change technique, or it has to be delivered by this type of person with these qualifications, you know, or it has to be delivered to this specific population. So the people, the protocol includes the intervention only being delivered to, you know, people who are currently classified as inactive, for example. And so when we talk about the fidelity of an intervention, which is an important thing to consider, because that might be something that is impacting the effectiveness when we evaluate it. We're talking about whether or not the intervention is actually being delivered and implemented as it was intended. So with respect to the exercise referral schemes, when you look at the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence guidelines in the UK, they're very vague, but there are a couple of things they are quite specific about with respect to exercise referral schemes, and that is with respect to who they should be delivered to. So the recommendations from NICE are that they should be delivered to individuals with pre-existing long-term health conditions. And so that is something that does seem to be adhered to. People don't typically get recommended or referred to an exercise referral scheme if they don't have those. But they're also supposed to be delivered to those who are currently inactive, because the limited evidence that existed when those guidelines were put together were that if you give an exercise referral scheme to someone who is already pretty active, it doesn't have much of an effect, which kind of makes sense. And that the best efficacy seemed to be, in this case, actually, it was effectiveness. The greatest effectiveness seems to come from giving exercise referral schemes to people who are currently inactive. And so this is in the paper I mentioned that was recently accepted. We also looked at the physical activity levels of individuals undergoing these exercise referral schemes, and we looked at their activity levels at the beginning of the scheme, and we also looked at how much their activity levels changed as a result of the scheme. And the most interesting finding for us was that the majority of individuals beginning the exercise referral scheme were already classified based on the physical activity guidelines as being moderately active. And so that could be one reason, for example, why we're not seeing meaningful improvements in health and well-being outcomes, because the individuals, the protocol, the prescription that says that these schemes should be delivered to people who are currently inactive is not being followed to a high enough fidelity. People are being referred to these schemes who are already active. And, this then gets into, kind of wider sort of political discussion around these types of schemes. There's always been talk, and I remember hearing it years ago, that people would, pretend to be inactive to get a free gym membership by joining an exercise referral scheme. And,
Jesus. But
the wider point then comes around to this idea of kind of implementation science. And implementation research is kind of the next step from effectiveness research. So there's been more of a push now to try and combine effectiveness and implementation research together to be a bit more kind of efficient in this type of work. So thinking about the kind of research translational pathway, you start off, well, actually, even before that, you might start off with kind of mechanistic studies looking at, say, does this exercise intervention impact this, particular, signaling pathway that's responsible for, I don't know, blood glucose regulation. It looks like this scheme, this type of intervention has an impact on this. Okay, right. Well, now we want to do an efficacy trial and see whether or not delivering that intervention in a very internally valid study with tight controls actually reduces, blood glucose or, improves insulin sensitivity or whatever. Okay, we find out the intervention works, it produces those benefits, but now we want to know whether or not, if we take that exercise protocol and deliver it as part of a type 2 diabetes exercise program out in the in the local clinics, whether or not we'll still be able to see the magnitude of improvements in glucose regulation or insulin sensitivity or whatever, or HbA1c, whether or not we can translate that out to it. So you do that trial and maybe you find out that it seems as though the effects aren't, anywhere near as good as we would hope they would be based on the efficacy of the intervention. And so then the question becomes, well, we know it works if people do it. So now what we have to do is we have to figure out different ways of packaging it and different ways of implementing it. And maybe whether or not we need to implement it with additional add-ons to the intervention in the form of behavior change techniques and things like that to try and maximize the fidelity of that intervention. But even before that, before you decide what those things are, you might want to do some kind of process evaluation to find out, okay, well, what elements of the intervention weren't being delivered to the fidelity, the degree of fidelity that we would expect based on what we decided. So, and this is where, I in one of the papers I sent over, they talk a lot about evaluation frameworks. And these are frameworks for trying to understand how interventions have been implemented out in the real world. And so you've got things like and I'm going to forget I always remember the acronyms, but forget what they actually stand for now. Things like the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, frameworks like one that I'm particularly fond of and we use a lot is the REAIM framework, which looks at various different aspects of intervention delivery. So REAIM, for example, looks at the reach of the intervention, how many people within the target population that you're trying to deliver it to is it actually reaching, the effectiveness of it, so measuring whether or not it's translating that efficacy into effectiveness, looking at the adoption of it, so you might prescribe it to or recommend it to individuals, but how many then actually do adopt that intervention and start doing it. You then got the implementation elements of it, so that might be, adherence. It might be, various things. So if the intervention is being delivered by, training staff, for example, personal trainers, then are they actually? You might design the intervention, give it to the trainers, and then they go away and deliver it. Are they actually delivering it? Is that intervention that you designed being translated, and does it reach the end user in the way you intended it if it goes through these different steps? There are all these different kind of like areas where the interventions can leak effectiveness, I guess is one way of putting it. And unless we're kind of evaluating and measuring them, we don't really know where we should start to try different things to improve the way in which we implement those interventions. But once we have figured that out, once we've figured out like, okay, well, maybe it seems as though for some reason people aren't adhering to the intervention, or it seems as though, some people, my trainers are, the participants don't like, the intensity of effort required, and my trainers aren't encouraging them enough to, that it's important. And so they're letting, intensity of effort slip. So how do we then address that? Well, we then come on to the implementation questions, which is, essentially no different than questions about efficacy or effectiveness. We can design different implementation interventions to then compare to one another. So, for example, in facilities, you could decide to have a go at delivering an intervention, but manipulating the way in which you implement it. So you could, and in this case, you could even, for example, try your own randomized control trial. And companies do this all the time in the form of things like A/B testing. So they'll tweak a slight different thing on their website, and of course it's a bit different because if you've got hundreds and thousands of click-throughs coming through, you can very quickly do a very highly statistically powered randomized control trial where you randomize half to receive this header and this message and half to receive a different header and this message, or this picture of Lawrence smiling or this picture of Lawrence with sunglasses on, and
both would get no clicks.
But the point is, you can effectively do that research yourself. You can ask those questions, and you can employ a simple randomized design to try and maximize the implementation. And when it comes to the implementation question, although it's useful to have a measure of the effectiveness to see what impact those implementation approaches are having on effectiveness ultimately as well, it may be you also want to know whether or not they're impacting the things that you think are affecting effectiveness. So, if you think that adherence or whatever is the thing that's leaking the effectiveness in your implementation of a particular intervention, then you want to know whether or not the thing that you're doing to try and implement and improve adherence is actually doing that or not, and then therefore translating into greater effectiveness. Because you might find that you do a slightly different way of implementing your intervention, and you notice that effectiveness doesn't change. Well, is that because adherence didn't improve, or is it because adherence did improve and it turns out that actually adherence isn't the thing that's important? Unless you're measuring these things, you're not really able to come to evidence-informed conclusions about what's affecting what.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what? I was going to ask you questions to try and figure out how the implementation science would apply to a hit business, but you just answered that all for me. I think there's a common saying. I think it's a Peter Drucker quote: "You can't manage what you don't measure." Luke's popular for talking about rifle shots, which is a concept from. What's the guy's name? Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great and Built to Last and many other books. And basically the concept is, it's kind of related to what we're saying. It's you take a rifle shot, which is you want to test a change in your business to improve a certain outcome, like a marketing change or retention or fill in the blank. You test it on a very small, low cost, low risk basis. So the idea being a rifle being a small instrument of warfare. I think the example in his book is he's on one ship aiming at another ship, and they want to launch all their cannons at the ship, but in order to calibrate, obviously make that shoot all those cannons is highly costly, and they'll have to reload and blah blah blah. And if they get it wrong, it could be very vulnerable. And then it's a really long-winded analogy. But then the idea is if you obviously shoot a rifle and you calibrate that, then and when you line it all up, then when it comes to launching all the cannons, that you've already figured out how to calibrate them optimally, and it's low risk with the rifle. That was a terribly explained analogy, but hopefully it makes sense. And I point people to the article, the original article, and if you're interested in Hit Business membership, Luke actually describes his entire strategy around rifle shots for testing changes in his business with low risk. So there you go. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that is a good analogy, actually. I like that. I guess there's probably one last thing to add, which if people are going to, for all intents and purposes, do their own research, is that, one question you need to ask yourself is, what is meaningful to me? What is meaningful to me? What is meaningful to my clients? And what is the smallest effect that I would be interested in? What's the smallest effect that I would care about? What's the smallest effect where anything less than that, for all intents and purposes, I'd consider to be no effect whatsoever? And this is a really important question to ask, because you need to know that before you can really evaluate whether or not the results that you've got are big enough to care about. And this is something that it's not even done in research. Our field, of exercise science as a whole, is terrible at this. We've been terrible at it in the past. If you ask me now whether or not any of the studies that currently exist in the literature measuring hypertrophy reflect meaningful improvements in muscle size, I don't think anyone could answer that question. No one knows whether or not a change of 1 millimeter of muscle thickness translates to something that anyone would care about. So when it comes to deciding on what outcomes you want to measure, also think to yourself, how big does the effect need to be for me to give a shit about
it? Well said. James, just aware of time, can you run over? What's your hard stop, your side?
No, I'm pretty good.
Awesome.
My wife will be home shortly, but she knows that we're chatting. So
okay, cool, good to hear. All right, so just thinking where we can go from here. Do you know what I did have some questions. If you don't mind backtracking for a moment to your paper about referral schemes.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention. Let's see here. Okay, no, that's not that interesting. Let's see what else we have. Yeah, there's this one. So one of the findings in the discussion section of the paper, you talked about how, with regard to systolic blood pressure, you had significant improvement. I don't know if this was meaningful. Maybe you can clarify. With isometric exercise, which produced far larger reductions in systolic blood pressure, and I thought that was quite interesting. Can you infer? Is that interesting enough that you could actually infer anything from that as being isometric exercise being an interesting protocol, more effective in this context? Or do you know the one I'm referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for clarity, so in that paragraph we talk about the results on systolic blood pressure, and I think if you go to, hang on, I'll tell you what figure it is. I believe I've lost it now. So figure 3, we have a forest plot of of the results of systolic blood pressure. So for those of you, anyone reading along at home, it's a quick rundown.
Reading along.
For those who are unfamiliar with what a forest plot is, so this would be very familiar for anyone who's looked at a meta-analysis where they've looked at second reanalysis of studies. And so normally you would see all of on the x-axis, you've got, in this case, each exercise referral scheme that was looked at. You've got the sample size for the referral schemes there as well. So you can see some of them were quite big, some of them were quite small, or at least the data available was more or less depending upon the scheme. And then on the y-axis at the bottom, you've got the change in systolic blood pressure. So this is how much it changed from pre to post scheme. You've then got little square boxes with lines either side of them, and those are the estimates for the change in blood pressure from each of the schemes individually, along with the 95% confidence intervals, as I mentioned earlier, and you can see them on the right hand side in text as well. And then at the bottom, you've got that diamond shape. Now, the middle of the diamond shape is essentially the overall estimate from all of these schemes using this random effects meta-analysis model, which takes into account the fact that all of these schemes are essentially a random selection of exercise referral schemes from all of the schemes that could possibly exist. They probably all differ in various different ways, and so it takes into account that heterogeneity. And in the model itself, you can see that some of the squares are actually slightly different sizes. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger, depending upon how variable within those schemes the effects were. That estimate gets more or less weight in the overall statistical model. So if it's a big square, then it means that we add more weight to the estimate from that one. So for example, if you look at the very bottom scheme, 5056, that had it had the largest number of participants in the scheme, and so it had a very precise estimate. The confidence intervals are very narrow compared to, say, 5063, which only had 7 people in. I think it was quite a new scheme when the database started. And anyway, so the diamond at the bottom, the length of the diamond is essentially corresponds to the confidence intervals for the overall estimate, and the middle of the diamond is the mean value essentially. But what we've got on the graph as well is we've got these two red dashed vertical lines, and the reason they're on there is because before we started doing our analysis, we asked ourselves the question of how big a change in systolic blood pressure would we need to see to give a shit about, essentially. And so because we were interested in whether or not we got meaningful changes, we determined what would be considered a minimal clinically important change in that outcome. And so in this example, for all of the outcomes that we were able to go back into the literature and see whether or not there were either accepted kind of thresholds for what would be considered a meaningful change, or whether there were studies that had anchored it to other outcomes. So for example, some studies look at proxy measures, but then they anchor them to the measure that they're really interested in to see, how big a change in the proxy do you need to see before you start seeing changes in the thing you're really interested in. And so what you can see with systolic blood pressure was actually one of the variables that did change. That was almost big enough for us to care about. What we saw was that the confidence intervals for our estimate ever so slightly nudged into the what we call the null interval. So between those red lines are, for all intents and purposes, saying that it's no different than zero, really. And so what we did conclude is we said, look, there might be a meaningful change in systolic blood pressure, but because our estimate includes these null effects as well, we're not going to pin our hat on that and be completely confident. But anyway, so in that section of the discussion, we obviously compared the findings that we had to other studies that had looked at the effects of exercise more generally on systolic blood pressure, and studies that had previously looked at exercise referral schemes similarly to this had found similarly small effects. But one type of exercise which there is actually very good evidence, at least in terms of efficacy, with respect to reductions in systolic blood pressure, is isometric exercise. And so that there are studies looking at grip strengthening. There are studies looking at my favorite exercise, the wall sit, that have found much bigger reductions in blood pressure compared to just exercise generally, whether that's endurance exercise or dynamic resistance exercise, and obviously meaningful changes as well, or you could even argue meaningfully more than the changes seen in other interventions. So isometric exercise, and there's actually good evidence from meta-analyses on this, looking at the efficacy of isometric exercise for reductions in systolic blood pressure.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. All right. So let me just see what else I had.
I suppose it's worth quickly saying as well, though, we do still lack effectiveness data on that. But funnily enough, there's not that many people doing isometric exercise.
So, okay. What was the end of the study, the end of the discussion bit? There's the acronym ESES. What was that? What does that stand for again?
Oh, that was the exercise self-efficacy scale. So I think there was, if I'm remembering rightly, there
was improved. Yeah, sorry. Go on.
Yeah. So, and this was the interesting thing that we found, and we're now trying to. It's a big task, but we're trying to get a standardized set of outcome measures for reporting for exercise referral schemes across the UK, because in this database, we just had data available on whatever the schemes collected, and it just so happened one of the schemes collected this outcome for some reason, and so it's really it's a scale that measures people's kind of self-efficacy to engage in exercise, but that improved as a result of it. Cool. But we don't really know whether that's meaningful or not because there's not a lot of evidence on that scale particularly.
Cool. So I'm going to ask you to probably prognosticate a little bit here and speculate, which I know you hate to do. But I'm going to put you in that position anyway. So obviously, your work you did here, and the other paper we've touched on, which is implementing exercise in healthcare settings, the potential of implementation science, which is actually fascinating and relates back to what we were talking about with regard to how you might implement a change in your hit studio business, for example, and see that if that change is meaningful. So I'll link that paper up in the show notes. Question I had in my mind there, but yeah, no, I'm interested, James, on what you think might be the protocol that we finally get to, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, as the one that is effective for the general population. Do you have an idea based on what research we have done, what that might look like, and what we might end up rolling out like nationally in the UK?
That is a tough question, because I guess you could refine that question a little bit more, or even break it into multiple questions. Whether or not you're asking about specific implementation of interventions within particular settings. So, for example, in healthcare settings where exercise is delivered, that they employ a particular resistance training protocol or whatever, and then you've also got the question of the exercise and physical activity recommendations more generally, like the Chief Medical Officer's physical activity guidelines for the UK. There are, I think we're, purely because there is more control, we're more likely to be able to influence change and effectively implement things in particular settings, as opposed to on a population level. On the population level, that's very difficult, particularly when it comes down to essentially making recommendations, because you can't necessarily deliver the exercise to everyone. And as you mentioned right at the beginning, I'm currently involved in the expert working group that are working on what the communication strategy is going to be within the UK for the physical activity guidelines. We're still trying to figure out, what evidence is available, and that, regarding the effectiveness of different interventions around messaging and communication to influence people's awareness, people's knowledge, and also, the thing that people really care about, which is, whether or not their behavior actually changes. But in the, I guess, healthcare settings, I don't necessarily know whether or not the intervention specifics itself are going to be the important thing here, because I think the main barriers are structural and kind of systems barriers, and what stakeholders there are, because ultimately what you have to do is you have to influence the relevant stakeholders and decision makers when it comes to implementing anything. So, and coming back around, full circle again, you have to have some evidence that, you can demonstrate effectiveness before you can then even persuade a decision maker or key stakeholder to then have a go at implementing the thing that you're selling, essentially. And then what you have to do, and this is something that we try and do, obviously, a process that we use at UK Active, which is to say we often start off by working with organizations, or whether that's public organizations or private organizations, and we're looking at interventions. We often start off with pilot studies. So we often, almost similar to as you were talking about with the rifle analogy, we'll try something on a small scale and to give us an idea of whether it looks like it's going to work or not, and also get a feel for how feasible it is to actually deliver in that setting, before then deciding whether or not it's worthwhile trying to scale it up and implement it. And if we do get to that stage, then one of the things that we always encourage is the implementation alongside or the embedding alongside any kind of implementation of the relevant data capture, so that you can, as you go along, you can evaluate whether or not it's having the effects that you're interested in, and make decisions as you go as to whether or not it should continue, whether or not you should scale it up further, etc. So it's a difficult question as to what the specific intervention is going to be, and I think what you're hoping I'm going to say is like, in 5 years' time, everyone's going to be doing HIIT training and so on and so forth.
2 workouts a week, 1 set of failure.
I can tell you categorically that is not what it's going to be. Although, having said that, there may be some individual organizations or even public health organizations that may start to use that. A good example is the Prehab for Cancer program. They are essentially using they're using single set protocols. They're progressively working towards single sets to failure using full body workouts, and that is being implemented with every cancer patient undergoing elective surgery in Greater Manchester at the moment, or at least as long as the funding for the service delivery lasts. But if it shows outcomes, if the things that we're actually with that study going to be looking at primary outcomes like recovery after surgery, and also looking at survival rates as well. So we're going to look at hard outcomes using the available health records to see whether or not the people getting this prehab program, are they actually more likely to survive surgery? Are they more likely to recover more quickly and to a great degree afterwards, and so on? And I can tell you now, the reason that happened is partly fortuitous, because I happened to be the individual who got talking with the people involved in that project, and they got me on board. It probably would have been a completely different intervention if someone else had been involved.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad you are involved in that. It's interesting to hear about that, and it's great. It's great to hear. And I know someone in Galway here actually, who's a professor of oncology, and he's also doing some research around using high intensity training potentially. Combined with intermittent fasting protocols to see how they would help with patients going through chemo. And he hasn't yet actually started doing anything in terms of the strength training side of things. He's been doing mostly the intermittent fasting, which I think is inspired by Walter Longo's work and his product. He's got I don't know if you're familiar, James, he's got this food product that's like based on his fasting protocol. And so he's doing stuff on that, which is cool. So maybe at some point when it makes sense, I might connect you to. Maybe there's some collaboration opportunities there. But he's one of these people who's kind of come across Body by Science and become a recent convert to HIIT, and just super passionate about it, as many people do become. Final question for you, James, before we wrap up. I can't do a podcast with you and not ask you about your current training regimen. I mean, that's just a staple, isn't it, for every podcast we do? And what made me laugh is I've been talking to Luke a lot lately. In fact, I've been talking to Luke a lot over the last couple of years because we've done so much work together, and I'm really grateful. And he obviously always is taking the mick out of you for training with body weight and not using the wonderful machines and the Med-X stuff you've got at the Solent as much. And then obviously he said to me the other day, he saw that you had your chin-up bar and your dip station outdoors in your back garden, and he was like, "Oh, James, what are you doing?" and obviously now with all the stuff that's going on with this pandemic, DS have transitioned completely to virtual training, and now they're all massive advocates of virtual personal training and using body weight and whatever's available. And now he's like a total convert, which is hilarious. Not that he didn't understand, obviously, that you would get just as good results probably training with body weight before, but he just loves his machines. So tell me, what I've been enjoying some of your Instagram videos of your quarantine workouts. So do you want to run us through what you've been doing lately?
Yeah, sure. And I must say, Lawrence, I laughed with James Fisher about this. I said, if there's anything about this quarantine, I feel so seen. Like, everyone is on the bodyweight bandwagon at the moment, and I was 10 years ahead of the curve.
That you were. So go on, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So actually, yeah, I'm quite fortunate actually because last year I was actually for a period of maybe 6 to 8 months I was training in facilities quite regularly, partly because I had a free gym membership as a result of my employment at UK Active. And so once a week with a colleague at UK Active who I recently got into doing more kind of high intensity strength training. I was training with him once a week at a facility in London, and it was just a fitness first facility.
Which
and,
one?
And also,
there's a lot,
it's High Holborn.
Oh yeah, I used to train at that one. Yeah,
Really?
right by the crossroads.
Yeah.
Right by the station. Yeah, well, I used to work at a firm called Clarinet, who are like a IT service provider, right near the station. And I trained at that fitness first. Like, well, I was doing HIIT then, so like a couple times a week. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't bad. It was a small facility, and as London is, it gets super busy. But we'd always try and get in there just before the lunchtime rush, and so I was doing that. And I also had a free membership at Places Leisure here in Eastleigh as a result of Dr. Steve Mann, who was on the Death by Efficacy paper. He was the previous research director at UK Active and then went to work for Places. So he hooked me up with that. But in the space of a month, and of course, I also had obviously access to the gym at Solent. And then in the space of a month, we lost our memberships as a result of some changes in some policies in some changes in some memberships at UK Active. So I no longer had access to the Fitness First for free, mind you. Also, the friends and family policy at Places changed, so I no longer had access to that. And then, obviously, Solent has now, you may or may not be aware, opened in the last year a big new sports complex. And so the gym that we used to have as part of our labs has been got rid of, and now we've got 3 brand new gyms, which are very well kitted out. They're really nice, but they are in a specific sports complex, and they're not, openly accessible. So
please tell me you still have the MedX, right?
Yeah. So that's all been moved into. We've now got like a specific musculoskeletal testing lab where all of the dynamometers are. So obviously they were testing devices as well as exercise devices. So they've been kept in the labs.
Can I come over and play at some point? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course you can. I have. Do you know what? When they got moved, I got a bit worried because obviously the lumbar extension is my baby. As much as I don't really do any research on it right at this moment, I did have a PhD student who is actually he passed last week. So Dr. Craig Perrin has been doing his PhD research on the effects of lumbar extensor fatigue on hamstring strain injury risk. But when they moved it, there was a few things that they didn't quite put back together correctly, and so I got absolutely covered in grease trying to take it apart and put it back together properly.
Oh wow!
Anyway, long story short was that I lost access to all these gyms, and so after spending 6 to 8 months, actually getting back into training in facilities a little bit more regularly, I suddenly had to go back to training at home, and we're now in we had bought a new place a couple of years ago, and I think I told you last time we spoke, I made the mistake of not checking all of the door frames to see if my little door gym fit in there,
which is obviously a key criteria for any house purchase.
Yeah, I don't know how I missed it. So I said to myself, right, that's it. I'm gonna build a pull-up bar and dip station in the back garden. So yeah, last summer I got some 4-inch fence posts and some iron bars and some non-slip outdoor fence paint, and some bags of concrete and put it together myself. And to be fair, it's been really nice to train out in actually even even getting out and training in the rain, there's a kind of a rocky element to it that feels quite good. And I must say, actually, I trained outside all through the winter, and as it's starting to get warmer now, I'm actually missing training outside in the winter. Training in the winter was really nice when it was nice and cool outside. It's like much better than being in an air conditioned facility. But yeah, so I have managed to pick up a few extra bits and bobs as well. I managed to get hold of when they were clearing out the old gym. I don't know if you remember, we had a rack of kind of rubberized dumbbells, and they sold off all the equipment, but there were some bits that didn't get taken, and so there was a pair of 27.5 kilo dumbbells that were left. So I nabbed them and took them home, and I picked up a belt with a chain so that I could use those dumbbells for weighted dips or weighted pull-ups if I felt like it. And then I've obviously got the suspension trainer for doing bodyweight rows that I've had for years anyway. And actually in the last 2 weeks, I managed to pick up like a set of old, like rusty iron plates and a couple of an easy bar and bits and bobs just to do some curls for the variety. Not that I need it or care about it, but hey, if you've got it, why not? But yeah, so I was.
I thought you were going to say curls for the girls then.
Well, that's for the gram. So yeah, so I was previously, up until quarantine, I was doing training twice a week. I was doing like an AB routine, very similar to what I was previously doing when I was bodyweight training almost exclusively. And the reason for that is because I was also playing basketball once a week, and I was still doing a little bit of sprint training as well. But now I'm actually doing 3 sessions a week at the moment, and have been since lockdown started, just partly for keep myself sane at the moment whilst being locked in. So I do.
You find recovery fine with that?
Yeah, not too bad actually, not too bad. I had actually the last couple of weeks, I've done a couple of, been out and actually done a couple of 5K runs just because someone nominated me to do it for this
I saw that
charity run thing on Instagram. So I was like, yeah, why not? I don't think I've ran a 5K for probably 15 years, or at least not went and tried to run it fast. So of course had no idea on the pacing, so set off way too quickly and destroyed myself. But it was quite good, and as the weather had been nice, I thought last week I went and did another one. But yeah, no, I've actually got very much the same. I've got 2 bodyweight workouts that I do sort of Monday, Wednesday-ish. Normally 2 or 3 days apart, which is exactly the same as they used to be. So like push-ups, pull-ups, supinated, wall sit and bodyweight squats, dips, bodyweight rows, and then I do an isometric adduction and plank into like McGill Crunch.
So you do, isometric, what, with like a band for abduction and like a...
no, it's actually just a belt, like a
belt.
Like one of those old canvas belts.
It is.
I think it came with a pair of shorts that I bought, and I thought the belt was hideous, so I just chucked it in my drawer with other workout paraphernalia.
And what do you use for isometric adduction? Do you just have like a squidgy ball or a mat or something in between your thighs?
I've actually got a foam roller, which is a nice kind of width, and because it's quite long as well, it's quite nice because you can have it sort of like down in between, your shanks, and sort of push all along, not necessarily.
I don't know why I laugh at that. I just the use of the word shanks, I think, is what got me going.
So
what's the McGill Crunch? What is that?
I think we talked about that before, where
I forget.
You normally have one leg raised at a like 45-degree angle, and have your other leg out straight, and then you normally support your lower back with your hands, and it's a very small range of motion, and you're just literally curling sort of from mid torso. So if you Google it, you'll see it. You'll probably find some videos of it. But it's I think it's called the McGill Crunch because it comes from Stuart McGill.
Yeah. Let me ask you about an exercise quickly, and then we'll wrap up. Obviously, loving what Discover Strength are doing right now, the virtual training. I had a workout with Xavier Robinson, who destroyed me virtually, and it was amazing. And I just never would have thought that I could get such an improvement to my workout in this context, being supervised, but I definitely did. And one of the things he didn't have me doing it during this workout. I did it self-supervised afterwards in like a B routine. And it was a plate touch. So you have your feet up on a chair and you're in like a push-up position, and you have a plate, or it could be any object on the floor, sort of downwards. You're facing on the floor there, and then you're just alternating your hands and touching the plate, and you're just sort of swaying your hips to left to right. Does that make sense? Are you getting where I'm coming from?
I'm trying to visualize it. So hang on. Describe it again. You're lying on your back?
No. So you're in a push-up position, but your feet are raised on like a chair or something like that, right?
Right, okay.
And then you've got an object on the floor, which is directly between your shoulders. So like if you face down, it's like right there, Mm-hmm. And basically what you're doing is you're alternating touching the object with each hand. But to do that, you have to basically balance your entire body weight on one hand.
Right.
As you alternate, and it causes you kind of lots of your different muscles are in play in terms of keeping you sort of stable as you touch the object.
Sure.
And it's quite a nice post exhaust once you've done like a lot of sort of push-ups or tricep work and things like that. And I think that's how they use it in their programming. But have you? I'm guessing you haven't probably done that exercise before or know too much about it, but I was just curious if you knew what muscles would be main involved in that type of exercise.
Well, I mean, it seems like essentially just a variant of a kind of plank with.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as you said. There's going to be a lot of kind of quote unquote core stabilizers involved in maintaining that trunk posture. Obviously, if you're on one, if you're putting your weight through one arm unilaterally, and your center of mass is offset from that, there's going to be kind of stabilizers around your shoulder working as well. I mean, I think I've said before, I'm way more open than some of the kind of like old school HIIT advocates nowadays for, if there's, and it's because I speculate that having a little bit of variety is probably good on a grand scale for translating effectiveness, because people are more likely to do it. And
bringing it back.
Some of these more interesting, a little bit of novelty and variety. Not everyone is a robot like me and able to do the same exercises for an entire lifetime. And he says that whilst he also has recently just added back in some curls and skull crushers just for the fun of it. But having those different exercises and trying out different things, variety is the spice of life for most people. I mean, I like the idea of that. I don't know if you've seen, I've been doing like muscle ups and stuff recently.
Yeah.
Not really as an exercise for quote unquote training, but more just because I happen to have a bar out in the garden now, and I was curious as to whether I could do them or not, and I did a couple, and it was quite fun. So I thought, hey, why not do them every now and then?
Awesome. We'll have to do another podcast at some point, James, just about this stuff and just about your training and exercises in general, because I'd love to cycle through some of the popular exercises and talk about your sort of learn from you in terms of the muscles that are involved, and to help us all with our own programming. So maybe we'll do that at some point. But I just wanted to say, thank you so much for joining me today, mate. This has been really fun and different and informative. So thanks again. Really appreciate it. And for everyone listening, to find the blog post for this episode and download the PDF transcript, please go to highintensitybusiness.com, search for episode number 273. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Discover how to achieve your health and fitness goals, become a great personal trainer, and build a successful, high-intensity training business. Check out highintensitybusiness.com. highintensitybusiness.com.
This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I have ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all of the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To find out more about ARX and get $500 off install when you place an order, please go to arxfit.com and mention HIB, that's High Intensity Business, in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $500 off install when you place an order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter HIB in the How Did You Hear About Us field.